Vorn is a powerful but useless archer who got captured by an enemy princess after she defeated his empire. However, after learning that she has feelings for him and desperately wants to smash, he asks to use her army to protect the people of his village and promises to blow her back out anytime she wants in exchange. It all starts after a bloody war between the kingdoms of Brune and Zictid, where Brune suffers a terrible loss. As Vorn walks through the scattered remains of his fellow Brune soldiers, he spots the enemy Princess Elen, a smoking hot war maiden who single-handedly decimated an army of 25,000 men while leading one with only 5,000 soldiers. He immediately decides to attack her with the 5 arrows left in his quiver, hoping to salvage some of the Brune Kingdom's reputation. But after his first 2 arrows take down the horses in front, Elen charges towards him and slices right through the other 3 arrows, and after reaching him, she decides to take him back as her property. The next morning, he gets woken up by a sword shoved into his mouth by Lim, a blonde warrior with the juiciest drumsticks you've ever seen. She then takes him to see Elen, who explains that the Kingdom of Brune has to pay a large ransom, or he will officially become her property. Later, Vorn is forced to show off his skills with a bow and arrow, but after 2 failed attempts to hit the target, a soldier named Rurik wonders if Elen had sand in her eye when she decided to take him as her slave. Right then, a rebel tries to assassinate Elen, but she activates a special wind skill that shatters his arrow before Lim orders some soldiers to capture him. Upon seeing this, Vorn asks if they will capture him alive, and when she replies that it would be too risky, he casually fires an arrow straight into the rebel's foot to make his arrest easier. Rurik gets surprised to see him hit the target because he had rigged the bow, and Elen commends his effort. In the throne room the next day, she offers to behead Rurik for messing with the bow, but Vorn begs on Rurik's behalf, so she decides to just punish him instead. He then asks why she made him shoot arrows in front of everyone in the first place, so she explains that it was the only way to make them realize that what she actually fell in love with was his ability to control an arrow, not his Halloween pumpkin face. While he takes it in, she offers him a job in her army and promises to make sure he is treated with proper respect, but he declines, saying that he has a country to protect. Days later, Rurik decides to adopt Saitama's hairstyle and explains to Vorn that he chose to look like an eggshell as a way of showing his gratitude and also a pledge of allegiance to become his student. Shortly after this, Vorn strolls into a park and gets excited to see a little dragon. But then his Excalibur also receives some extra blood flow when he sees Elen completely exposed as she prepares to wash her divine plot cannons. He immediately turns his back and apologizes, but she tells him not to worry and invites him in so they can clean each other up. Hours later, he finds himself in bed thinking about her glossy cakes, but then Rurik shows up to tell him that they captured a Brunish soldier who claims to know him. Vorn immediately rushes out and gets excited when he sees Bertrand, a dollar store Alfred who has been attending to him for years. However, Bertrand tells him that there is no time to waste because a nobleman named Zion is about to destroy Alsace with an army of 3,000 men. Upon hearing this, Vorn immediately tries to leave Zictid, but Elen shows up at the gates to stop him. Sometime during the previous day, Duke Felix called Zion and ordered him to take over Alsace, causing him to get excited because he had always hated Vorn. However, things got a lot more interesting when Felix took him to see 2 dragons they had been training and told him to use them for the mission. Back in Zictid, Vorn tells Elen that he has to go back and fight for his people, but she refuses to let him pass. He then tries to think of a way to convince her, but after taking a closer look at her glistening thighs, he remembers what happened in the bath and almost forgets what they were just talking about. She quickly notices this and asks if he likes what he sees, but he regains his composure and promises to return after saving his people. The next moment, she pulls out her sword and tells him not to bother trying because it would be stupid to take on an army of 3,000 men on his own. When he insists on leaving, she expresses disappointment and asks if he no longer has the ability to think rationally. This causes him to stop for a minute, and after thinking a little clearly, he asks for permission to borrow her troops for the battle. Upon hearing this, she starts laughing and commends him on being bold enough to even ask that, before saying that she will only accept on the condition that he will turn Alsace over to her after they defeat Zion's army. After he says that it won't be a problem so long as she treats his people with kindness, she gathers an army of 1,000 men and rides out with him to save Alsace. On the way there, she asks if they really have a chance since Zion outnumbers them 3-1. So he reminds her that Alsace is his home and explains that they can use his knowledge of the surrounding terrain to get an advantage. Hours later, Zion begins the march towards Alsace. Meanwhile, a warrior named Steed asks Felix for the real reason behind his sudden decision to conquer Alsace. Felix then reminds him that the crown prince was unalived by Hélène during the recent battle, and this has caused the king's claim on the throne to weaken. With the struggle for royalty being inevitable, another warlord named Gainlon will likely try to take over Alsace since it's the most remote nation in Brune, but he has decided to claim it for himself first. Steed then asks why he chose to send Zion with an entire army for such a rundown nation, and Felix further explains that he needs to master the art of war and also learn to control the dragons. By then, a hot maid named Tita has already started sending the physically strong citizens of Alsace into the mountains, while the weaker ones rush into the temple since they are considered sacred ground in all of Brune. After making sure they are all safe, she rushes back to Vorn's estate to protect the bow passed down from his ancestors. As she starts reminiscing on the time they spent together before leaving for the war against Zictid, Zion's soldiers begin their rampage throughout the city. While watching them, he gets bored and considers using the dragons to burn everything down. But then he remembers when Felix told him that they were still unstable and only served as a show of strength to any potential rival. The next moment, a soldier returns to tell him that all the locals are hiding in the temple, and after realizing that they can't do anything to a holy building, Zion turns his sights on Vorn's estate. Minutes later, Tita hears someone trashing the mansion, so she summons enough courage and runs down to find Zion. She immediately tells him to leave, but he grabs his sword and starts ripping her clothes off while promising to destroy everything Vorn holds dear. She eventually manages to grab a small knife to attack, but he easily knocks it out of her hands and pushes her out to the balcony. He then decides to use her plot as stress relief from all the fighting, but the moment he reaches to grab her melons, an arrow gets shot into his hand. As he immediately starts screaming like the low testosterone dimwit he is, Vorn rushes in and tells Tita to jump. However, at the last moment, one of Zion's soldiers trips up his horse, so Hélène uses her sword's wind magic to safely guide them both to the ground. While the other soldiers rush in to find Zion, Tita starts bawling her eyes out and tells Vorn everything they have been through, so he thanks her for taking care of everyone while he was gone. Just as Hélène admits to feeling a little jealous, Vorn stops an arrow from literally blowing off Tita's head and immediately takes out the shooter. However, he ends up with a cut across his palm, so Tita quickly wraps it up while Hélène leads the rest of her soldiers to attack Zion's army. Vorn also decides to head, but then he realizes that his bow is damaged, so Tita hands over the dark bow his father left to him. Early the next day, Vorn and Hélène decide to re-strategize over a meeting, because most of Zion's army managed to escape right before the battle got serious. After a lot of contemplating, and considering the fact that they are still outnumbered 3-1, they decide to chase them into the plains, but Vorn also comes up with a plan to ensure their victory. Meanwhile, Zion is currently back in base camp, losing his senses over the fact that Vorn somehow managed to get an army of Zictid soldiers. After his generals explain the current situation to him, the pain from his still bleeding hand causes him to get even more upset, so he decides to prepare an offensive counterattack to finish Vorn off. Shortly after this, the rest of his men mobilize into a basic attack formation, but this time he also decides to use the dragons. Around the same time, Tita has just rounded up a bunch of ropes from the locals left in Alsace, and after she returns to the estate, Vorn explains that his plan involves using the horses left behind by Zion's men. Over an hour later, they catch up to Zion's army, and while Hélène immediately starts tearing through the men on the front line, Vorn fires off countless arrows to stop as many as he can from getting any closer. To nobody's surprise, they succeed in taking out most of Zion's soldiers, but then he suddenly sends the first Earth Dragon to attack them. As they all freeze in shock, the rest of Zion's soldiers quickly surround them to make escape impossible, so Vorn shoots at the dragon's eye, but the arrow shatters on impact. Upon seeing this, Zion starts mocking them and tells Vorn to forget about making it back alive, but then a new group of Zictid soldiers show up to fight off the rest of Zion's men, so Hélène takes the opportunity to face the Earth Dragon on her own. Naturally, they all get shocked to see that she is even trying to take it on alone. But then she recites an incantation that releases an orb of divine energy from her sword. As soon as she fires it on the dragon, it gets lifted into the air and split in half in front of every soldier on the battlefield. Before Vorn even asks, she explains that she has never used it before, because it would obviously reduce mere humans to ground beef. With the dragon defeated, they resume their attack against Zion's army, so his generals ask for a new plan, but he loses it as usual and decides to pull back every soldier still alive. The moment one of the generals tries to offer a different strategy, Zion smacks him across the face and immediately recoils from the pain of his injuries. Shortly after this, Lim and a handful of Zicted soldiers split from the main force and return moments later with the spare horses from before to create the illusion of having an even greater army ready to attack Zion and his men. Minutes later, the rest of Zion's troops start to retreat, but then Elen and Vorn lead their soldiers to continue attacking them, causing Zion to finally realize that there is no escape. Once again, the generals suggest using the second dragon, so he reminds them of how Elen casually sliced the first one in midair and says he won't be held responsible for losing 2 dragons in one day. At that moment, Vorn catches up to his army and tells him to admit defeat, but Zion refuses and starts calling him a traitor for bringing Zicted soldiers into Brünn. After a couple more minutes of yapping about how Vorn is a peasant lucky enough to have his own estate, Zion challenges him to a duel, and he immediately accepts. Zion then mounts a horse with the longest spear he can find, and upon seeing that Vorn wants to use his bow and arrow, he loses it and asks Vorn if he lost his senses during all the fighting. After assuring Zion that he will still win, Vorn starts shooting arrows at the same spot, but Zion barely notices and charges towards him. However, just as he gets close enough to nick Vorn, the last arrow penetrates the shield and cuts right through his arm. Upon seeing this, the generals charge in to protect Zion, so Elen and her soldiers also rush in to keep Vorn safe. The next moment, Zion takes off on the second dragon and mocks them as usual. But in a weird turn of events, Vorn's arrow tells him to shoot Zion down. Despite being confused, he aims for the dragon, and after the bow siphons some energy from Elen's sword, Vorn fires off an extremely powerful shot that obliterates Zion and drops the dragon while the rest of his soldiers watch in horror and completely lose all hope. Days later, Titta gets excited to finally have a regular morning with Vorn back in the estate, but her happiness completely vanishes the moment she walks into his room and sees Elen about to take their slave and master relationship to the next level. At the breakfast table minutes later, she demands to know why Elen was trying to shove her sword down his throat, but he tells her not to worry about it and asks Elen why she was even awake so early. She then explains her decision to return to the Zicted capital city for a meeting with the king and promises to be back as soon as she can. Shortly after this, she tells Lim to stay back and support Vorn, but she hesitates and asks Elen why she is so supportive of Vorn. Elen then reminds him of the god-level skill he used to take down Zion, and also admits to her feelings for him before telling Lim to help him out until she returns. After she leaves, Titta gets dressed up and offers to follow Vorn on his stroll around town, so he takes a moment to think and ultimately agrees to let her tag along since she is the main reason the locals survived Zion's invasion. Meanwhile, Duke Felix has just summoned a man named Drekavac to discuss Ganlon's decision to withdraw his forces from Alsace after hearing about the way Vorn and Elen took down the dragons. After they both decide to send a group of assassins to take Vorn out, Felix also decides to send a second war maiden against Elen to make sure she can never interfere with their plans again. Back in Alsace, Vorn and Titta have just met up with 2 local farmers who immediately express gratitude for everything they did and proudly explain how they ran into the forest to hide while the real men fought alongside Vorn. Around the same time, Elen arrives in Siltia, the capital city of Zicted, and immediately presents herself before King Victor, who then asks for an explanation behind her decision to take Zicted soldiers into Brünnish territory without receiving permission. After she tells him that it was to help Vorn, he demands to know what reason Vorn could have possibly given her to trigger such a decision. So she explains his commitment to keeping the people of Alsace safe. Upon hearing this, King Victor, as well as the entire court of nobles, lose it. But then a beautiful lady named Sophia steps out and offers her respect to Victor before seeking permission to speak. Her gravity-defying globes immediately curb his anger, so he decides to hear her out. and she proceeds to label Helen's actions as a natural response to the threat of war. Minutes later, Helen tries to take a breather by the courtyard, but another war maiden named Ludmilla shows up to taunt her for instigating a war with the little freedom she was granted. After Helen says she will only consider the opinions of ladies who actually know how to grow their racks, Ludmilla commends her snapback but still tries to run her mouth. Thankfully, Sophia stops them and asks Helen why she hasn't left the capital city yet. So Sophia starts by thanking her for all the help before telling Ludmilla to scram so the fully developed baddies can have a proper conversation. As soon as Ludmilla leaves, Sophia tells Helen to start seeing her as an enemy and takes her to a nearby fountain before explaining that she has been in close contact with Duke Felix. Upon hearing this, Helen freezes in shock, and Sophia quickly admits that Felix is definitely not Ludmilla's type before further explaining that the strong ties between both their families are what caused her to settle with building a relationship with him. While Helen slowly comes to terms with the fact that she and Vorn have a lot more enemies than she expected, Vorn experiences a crazy dream about Titta and his dad before waking up in a barn beside her. After also waking up, she apologizes for oversleeping and says she just didn't want to put him through more stress. But he tells her not to worry about it and thanks her for letting him rest before heading out to decide on a plan for the rest of the day. The next moment, she hugs him from behind and promises to do anything he wants. But instead of telling her to get on all fours, he says that they have a lot of work to do for the long-term safety of Alsace. Shortly after this, they return to the estate and meet Masha's, who immediately demands to know why Lim has soldiers all around Alsace. Minutes later, he apologizes for his harsh tone, but she tells him not to worry since they are still technically rivals from opposing nations, which completely justifies his initial response. With that out of the way, Masha asks Vorn for his next course of action, and after he decides to go up against Duke Felix, Masha asks if he intends to seek aid from Gainlan. Vorn then explains that he wants nothing to do with either of them, so Masha decides to head to the Brune capital city to seek an audience with the king on his behalf, while he travels with Titta and Lim to seek allies from other nations in the kingdom. Days later, Lim takes him to a secluded mansion to see Helen, who then explains that King Victor accepted her decision to fight alongside him on the condition that Alsace would be handed over to Zictid if she gains full control over it. Vorn obviously gets stunned by this, but they tell him not to worry as they can easily create multiple factors to make sure that never happens. The real problem, however, lies with King Victor's second condition, which was that the interests of Zictid should come first in every situation. Vorn initially gets confused by this, so they explain that if a nobleman from Zictid randomly decided that siding with Duke Felix was the right move, they would end up having to fight against other Zictid armies as well. Just then, they hear someone at the door, and while Lim leaves to check it out, Helen further explains that the real issue with Victor's second condition lies with the fact that out of the 7 existing war maidens, one has already taken a stand with Felix. As she then tries to explain how vile Ludmilla is, the midget loudmouth storms in and asks Vorn for a moment of his time to chat. Minutes later, they all start riding out to a new region, so she uses that opportunity to tell him not to bother going against Felix because, aside from the fact that she is obviously going to be fighting alongside him, he is already a powerful force feared even in Zictid. The next moment, Vorn spots a trap, and after they all stop to take a look around, an assassin tries to blow his head off, but he quickly jumps off the horse to dodge it before shooting an arrow right into the assassin's head. Just then, another assassin drops in, so Lim cuts him down, only to suddenly get bitten by a deadly viper. While Vorn immediately starts draining the poison from her melons, Ludmilla uses her war maiden abilities to unalive the rest of the assassins. She then calls Helen an amateur for getting worked up over an assistant and heads out to get a doctor, while she and Vorn ride off with Lim to the nearest town. In a bath the next morning, Helen tells Lim all about her near-death experience and how Ludmilla saved her by finding a doctor after Vorn finished sucking all the poison out of her system. Upon hearing this, Lim gets embarrassed about having her milkers drained, but Helen tells her not to worry because she already prepared a special surprise to thank Vorn for saving her. Minutes later, Vorn enters a separate bath and ends up seeing the melon seeds growing on Ludmilla's chest. As she immediately grabs her staff to attack, he calmly admits that he shouldn't have even been in the bathroom and apologizes for not checking first, but she still proceeds to crack his skull. Shortly after this, they all head into town to find food, But then Ludmilla suddenly freezes when she spots a famous dish still fresh on the stove. Elen notices this and asks if she is finally going to drop the royalty act and eat peasant food like everyone else. So Ludmilla quickly regains her composure and claims she would rather starve instead. However, when Elen grabs a plate and starts munching down in front of her, the act slowly starts falling apart. Luckily, Vorn grabs her a plate as well and claims it's his way of apologizing for the bath incident. So she collects it and acts like he is the reason she decided to try it. Upon seeing this, Elen pulls him aside and demands to know why he is wasting his charm on her. But then Ludmilla claims she can never fall for a simp who obviously only cares about what his boss Elen wants. After Ludmilla storms out, Elen tells Lim to get their army ready for a possible ambush from her. And just a couple hours after this, they learn that Ludmilla had already assembled an army to trap them along with troops from Duke Felix. As both sides sandwich Elen's army to stop them from moving, she decides to work on a battle plan but stops to ask Vorn for his next course of action, because he either has to stay and fight Ludmilla alongside them or return to Alsace to prepare for a possible invasion from Felix or Gainlon. After taking a moment to think, Vorn decides to stay back and fight alongside them. So Elen continues figuring out a battle plan before launching an attack against Ludmilla's army. A day later, both sides decide to retreat after losing countless soldiers. So Elen calls Vorn and Lim for another meeting and admits that Ludmilla's defense was spot on. After also admitting that she is a formidable opponent, Lim wonders why she almost never joins her soldiers on the front line. But Vorn tells her to be happy about it because she could easily use her icicle skills to turn their soldiers into human kebabs. Lim then asks Elen if they have ever fought against each other, and after she claims that Ludmilla lost twice to her while she only lost once, Lim explains how Ludmilla said the exact same thing when she asked. However, just as Vorn gets invested in figuring out which of them was lying, Elen tells them to focus on the battle they still have to win. After Lim tells her that Ludmilla's army has been holed up in a citadel reinforced by her ice, Elen realizes that the previous battle was her way of getting an idea of where their army was so they could reinforce this new plan to hide behind the citadel's walls and attack the moment they spot Elen's army. Despite this, Elen decides to launch a full-scale attack against them. But after another grueling day of losing valuable soldiers, they return to base camp to re-strategize again. This time, Elen decides to use her sword's wind skill to jump into the citadel and take them by surprise. But Lim immediately tells her to forget about it because such a plan will only lead to Ludmilla using her severed head as a trophy. When Elen insists on going, Lim asks Vorn for his opinion, but Elen quickly reminds him that his new purpose in life is to agree with anything she says. He then starts by explaining how important she is to him and tells her to consider another plan instead of basically offering herself up to Ludmilla for free. This causes Elen to second-guess her stupid decision, and when she asks if he has any ideas for a better plan, he suddenly comes up with a brilliant idea. The next day, Lim finds him a hunter's cloak made out of a dead bear, and after helping him put it on, they both wish him luck on the mission. 3 days later, his search for a hidden path to the citadel starts becoming a lot more difficult as he runs out of food. But then he spots a fox over a mile away and shoots before it runs off. Minutes later, he finds its body with a second arrow before spotting Ludmilla, who then asks where he shot it from without realizing that it's actually him under the bear coat. After he points out the spot he shot from, she tells him to stop the cap, so he shoots another arrow into a tree around the same spot just to prove it. Upon seeing this, she gets surprised by his skill and apologizes for doubting him. She then takes him to a cave to share the fox, but as she strikes up a random conversation, he gets confused by her drastic change in behavior from when they first met the other day. When she asks him to take off the coat, he claims to be from a remote tribe that strictly forbids hunters from taking off their coat while in the woods, so she decides to stop prying but also asks him to come work under her. After he explains his lifelong goal of returning to protect his homeland, she accepts it and proceeds to make the best tea he has ever tasted before dumping years of pent-up trauma on him. While listening to her explain all the ways her life as a war maiden is actually miserable, Vorn starts feeling a little bad. But after she eventually runs off to the citadel, he slowly follows her tracks and eventually finds the secret route she used to sneak out. Days later, he returns with Elen and the rest of her soldiers, and as soon as they spot the gates, he notices that Ludmilla has already added extra barricades. Despite this, Hélène decides to proceed with the plan and rushes in with her sword to destroy the gate. But after she uses the powerful L'Édmose spell, the gate remains intact while a bunch of archers immediately try to take her out. Luckily, Vorn manages to push her out of the way in time, but she still insists on finding a way into the gate. So he takes a moment to think before asking her sword for some of its power, like when he took down Xion. After it answers and charges up his bow with magic, he blasts a hole right through the gate, so Hélène leads the charge into the citadel to finally defeat Ludmilla. As soon as they both meet up, the soldiers take a step back to avoid getting caught up in their duel. Ludmilla then tries to start with the usual insults, but Hélène decides to skip the unnecessary chatter and rushes in to attack her. After blocking her attack, Ludmilla unleashes her powers to counter, but Hélène quickly matches her energy, so they both continue fighting until a large crater forms right in the middle of the citadel. Hélène's soldiers immediately try to help, but she tells them to stand back and claims the fight will be over despite looking like she is about to pass out. Just as Ludmilla also claims it will be easy to defeat her, an assassin jumps into the crater and tries to attack her, but Vorn quickly shoots him in the head. At that moment, Ludmilla recalls his skill with the arrow earlier and realizes that he is the hunter. So she climbs out of the crater and slaps him across the face before demanding to know why he saved her instead of letting the assassin succeed. He then explains that it was the only way he could repay her for making the best tea he has ever tasted, so she takes a moment to think before asking what he wants. After he asks her to remain neutral instead of helping Duke Felix, she gets surprised and asks why he didn't ask for her alliance instead, so he further explains that protecting the peace of Alsace is all that matters to him. Upon hearing this, Ludmilla realizes that he has only ever cared about his people, so she decides to grant his request and promises to stop aiding Felix. Days later, she honors her word by completely pulling out of the war, but Felix proceeds with the next stage of his plan, which is to partner up with Roland, the strongest knight in the entire Brune Empire, who just casually tore through a foreign army trying to invade the kingdom. After the battle, he meets up with another respected knight to discuss the king's recent order for him to clap Vorn. A month later, Vorn returns to Brune and immediately heads to Duke Hugh's home to thank him for all the help with his army. After Hughes also thanks him for keeping to his word by fighting for peace, he leaves with an even greater army than before and eventually finds a vacant stretch of land to use as a base. After they all settle down, Lim and Hélène start arguing over a name to call their army. And just as Lim tries to rope him into it, Rurik calls him to stop two soldiers from fighting. As he heads out to figure out what the problem is, the girls stay back and wonder why Mashas has not returned from his trip to make a petition to the king on behalf of Vorn. Soon after this, they march out again and end up in a small town in the center of the region to secure supplies for the army with help from Hughes. Hours later, Vorn decides to return to his estate, but Hughes tells him to take a look around and find a place to have a little fun before leaving. Instead of taking his advice and finding the nearest strip club, Vorn ends up relaxing by a stream and tries to take a nap when Hélène's pet dragon suddenly jumps out of the bushes and crashes into him. Just as he tries to ask why it's running, Sophia runs out with her melons swinging in every direction and barely notices him until she trips over him. After Hélène also runs out to catch her dragon, she sees Sophia trying to suffocate her man with milk and freezes in shock. A couple minutes later, Sophia apologizes for not looking before saying that she actually came for official business from the Brunish king. However, when they all ask what he said, she explains that she never actually met him because he is suffering through an intense sickness. She did manage to make it clear that Hélène was only working as an aide to Vorn, but that seemed to be the last straw that triggered the Empire's decision to label Vorn as a criminal guilty of committing treason. As punishment for his alleged crimes, his rank and title have been stripped, and Alsace has now been placed under the king's rule until a new duke is assigned to it. Upon hearing all this, Vorn gets troubled and heads out to clear his head, while Sophia stays back with Hélène to discuss what might happen next. The next day, they gather again to talk about Roland and his soldiers, who are currently marching towards them to fight. After agreeing that the best course of action is to try and avoid a battle, they send messengers to Roland, hoping to come to an agreement, but Roland sends them back and insists on running the Fade, so Vorn and Hughes call all the other nobles supporting them to ask for more help. Days later, both armies finally meet up on the battlefield, and after Roland immediately starts tearing through Vorn's army, Elen charges toward him and manages to block one of his attacks, which surprises him since no one has ever been able to counter one of his hits. He stops to ask for her name, and after she introduces herself, he does the same and eliminates an entire troop in seconds before knocking her off her horse. As he then prepares to finish her off, Vorn calls out to her, so Roland decides to deal with him first. However, Vorn dodges and fires an arrow into the sky before grabbing Elen. Upon seeing this, Roland tries to chase after them, but the arrow Vorn shot up suddenly lands right in his horse's brain, causing Roland to realize that he missed on purpose. By then, Elen has just realized that Vorn actually got hit by Roland's sword, so she stops to help him with Roland's soldiers still hot on their tail. Luckily, Sophia shows up and sends them off before turning to take on an entire army by herself. With a single spell, she forces Roland's entire army back, but he casually walks right through the force field and commends her on being powerful enough to hold him back. In the meantime, Elen desperately tries to wake Vorn up, but the excessive blood loss causes him to remain unconscious. To stop Roland from catching up to them, Sophia starts fighting him and manages to hold him back for a couple more minutes before using her staff to teleport to safety. At that moment, a soldier informs Roland that Mashas and his men are currently trying to catch up to them. So Roland decides to stop chasing after Vorn and thinks back to the day he tried to meet with the king. On getting to the palace, he met Felix and Gainlon, who then claimed the king was not in a good enough state to entertain guests, but further explained that he would get a chance to see him after dealing with Vorn. Shortly after this, Mashas arrives at Vorn's army camp and sees that he is still unconscious even after being treated. After the girls thank him for showing up to scare off Roland's men, Hughes immediately calls for a meeting and asks how his meeting with the king went. Mashas then explains how he had to force his way into the palace because his request for an audience with the king was rejected. After learning that the palace was now being run by both Felix and Gainlon, the prime minister, Pierre, pulled him aside at a different time and took him into the king's chambers just to show him that the death of the prince was still greatly affecting the king's mental state. He further explained that his declaration of treason against Vorn was because Felix and Gainlon provided a very good case backed with evidence that made Vorn's actions seem like they were aimed towards the destruction of the Brune Empire. After listening to all this, Hughes and Elen ask Mashas how he knows Sophia, so he tells them how a group of assassins ambushed him on his way out of the palace. Luckily, she happened to be passing by and helped him take them down before leaving to meet up with Elen. Later that night, Elen spots two soldiers leaving Vorn's tent, so she asks Bertrand about it, and he explains that they are actually soldiers from Hughes' army who were impressed by the fact that he managed to land a hit on Roland's horse. She then heads inside and asks Titta for some alone time with him. So Titta joins Bertrand while Elen holds Vorn's hand close to her heart to make sure he can still feel her presence. Shortly after this, Sophia finds her just outside of camp and asks if she is going to use her dragon arts against Roland, and after Elen says yes, she offers to help. Meanwhile, in Roland's camp, a knight named Olivier has just told him about Felix's failed attempt to claim Alsace, which is what likely triggered Vorn's decision to seek help from Zicted soldiers. However, Roland still insists on attacking him since the Zicted army is still an enemy of the Empire. When Elen eventually begins the march with the rest of their soldiers, Vorn wakes up and recalls what happened before grabbing the bow to fight again. Just then, it speaks to him, and after Titta also wakes up, he asks for help to reach a place the bow just gave him directions to. Meanwhile, Elen and the other soldiers have just come face to face with Roland, who then orders his army to get into formation before they proceed to attack. Minutes later, Vorn and Titta arrive at an old temple, and after a couple minutes of walking around inside it, they find a statue of the goddess of death. Vorn then asks if she is the one who called for him, but then she possesses Titta and asks why he came when his soldiers are losing their lives against Roland. After she offers to give him strength if he can prove his resolve, she tells him to shoot Titta, but he naturally hesitates and asks if she will release Titta if he agrees to her terms. She then promises to spare Titta and also grant him more power than ever before, so he draws back the bow to shoot and infuses it with enough power, hoping to create an explosion right before it hits her. The goddess notices this and tells him that his plan is extremely risky, but he decides to go ahead with it regardless and fires off the shot. As planned, it explodes right before hitting her and only burns off her clothes. So he rushes over to cover her, while the goddess upholds her promise by granting him more strength. Minutes later, he mounts a horse and starts heading to the battleground, where Elend's plan to defeat Roland's army by turning the field into a mud bath has actually saved them from a quick defeat. While Hughes and the rest of the soldiers continue fighting Roland's men, Elend and Sophia combine their powers to attack Roland. But he easily cuts through every attack and commends their skill again before insisting that they cannot win. Right then, he senses an arrow coming and cuts it down before wondering how Vorn managed to shoot from such a distance. When he finally catches up and jumps off the horse, Roland tells the girls to sit tight so the men can talk. He then asks Vorn for the reason behind his decision to hire Zicted soldiers, and after he explains that it was all to ensure the safety of Alsace, Elend tells Roland to join them and make Felix pay for his crimes. To nobody's surprise, he refuses and draws his sword to fight. But at that same moment, Vorn's injuries start to bleed out again, so Elend holds him up and tells him to keep fighting. Despite being in immense pain, Vorn draws back the bow again and fires off his most powerful shot yet. But Roland still manages to block it and slices right through before releasing a blast that almost incinerates Vorn. However, after the dust settles, he surprisingly admits defeat because blocking the arrow completely paralyzed both of his arms. Early the next day, Rurik leads some of the soldiers to gather all the gear they can find for future battles, and as they work to pack up supplies, he keeps a close eye on Gerald, Hughes' son. Meanwhile, Roland tells Vorn that he plans to return to the capital to seek an audience with the king, and when Vorn reminds him that Moshus was nearly clapped for trying the same thing, he insists that it must be done and promises to get Vorn an audience with the king as well. Just then, Sophia notices that Elend isn't around for the meeting, so she asks Lim, who then explains that Elend stepped out to meet a messenger from Regnitz. Hours later, Roland pays his respects to his fallen soldiers and heads out, while Elend tells Vorn that she has to return to Zicted with her soldiers because a fellow war maiden named Sasha has asked for help to fight off another war maiden. After explaining that Sasha has been bedridden for the last few months, Elend also tells him that they promise to be there for one another at all times, so Vorn wishes her luck. A few days later, Roland arrives at the king's palace, but after being allowed inside, he gets trapped in a room by Gainlon, who then releases a swarm of deadly bees on him. By then, Elend and Lim have already left with their army, so Sophia also wishes Vorn luck with his future battles before leaving as well. Upon seeing that Rurik is still around, Vorn asks why he didn't leave with them, so he explains how harsh winters usually are back home and says there is no point in leaving since Elend will be back eventually. Soon enough, Moshus returns with news of what happened to Roland, and while Vorn struggles to accept that such a powerful knight was easily defeated, Felix tracks Gainlon down and demands to know why on earth he would unalive Roland. Gainlon instead tells him to focus on the Muzinal army currently marching into the Brunish Empire because they are known for destroying any nation, city, or town they stumble upon with an army of over 20,000 men. Days later, Felix marches out with his army to secure his region and keep Gainlon in check. Meanwhile, Vorn, who just spent the previous night thinking of a battle tactic, wonders if there is anything they can actually do against such a large and ruthless army. After taking a look at Roland's sword and recalling how he left it to him as proof of his acceptance for their cause, he regains a bit of hope. Just then, Tita shows up to tell him that breakfast is ready, and after eating a couple minutes later, he tells her to remain in camp with Bertrand and starts making plans with Rurik, who then asks if he has any idea to keep their soldiers motivated. Surprisingly, he admits that they have a high chance of losing, and after meeting up with Hughes and Moshus, he explains his plan to scout the Muzinal army with only a handful of volunteers before they figure out an actual attack plan. The next day, they carry out his scouting mission as planned and get a more accurate read on the Muzinal army. But on the way back, they also spot a couple rogue Muzinal soldiers chasing after an innocent lady, so Vorn quickly takes them out before saving her. Hours later, he meets up with Rurik and Gerald to get an accurate count of all the weapons they have available before deciding to start with the first stage of their battle plan. The following afternoon, General Qasim hears about a Brunish force of about 300 men rushing towards their army, so he tells the general to mobilize a unit of 3,000 men to chase them because they are likely just bait. Just as he predicted, the force of 300 soldiers lures their men to a mountainside. But they get shocked to see that Vorn somehow managed to gather an army of over 6,000 soldiers. They immediately try to retreat, but Vorn quickly leads his soldiers to finish them off. And after spending the rest of the evening gathering weapons, he thanks his luck that they were too stupid to realize that almost 80% of his army were actually props. Over the next couple of days, Vorn leads his men to slowly attack the Muezzanal army from deep within the mountainside in a bid to reduce their numbers as much as possible. However, Qasim eventually grows tired of this and decides to unalive a bunch of Brunish countrymen as a public spectacle to call him out. The next day, he mobilizes a unit of 3,000 men to serve as the front guard and gets surprised when Vorn shows up with barely 600 men to face them head-on. Just as he prepares to give the attack order, Rurik shows up with the rest of their army, but Qasim remains convinced that his troops will win regardless. Just then, he sees Vorn firing an arrow in his direction and calls him stupid for thinking it will reach from such a far distance, only to get sniped right in the center of his brain. The moment he falls off the horse, the rest of his soldiers panic, so Vorn charges in with his soldiers to defeat them all. After hours of chopping off heads and gathering as many supplies as they can, they free the captured countrymen, but one of them immediately cusses Vorn out for not coming sooner. Gerald immediately tries to attack, but Vorn holds him back and apologizes to the obviously traumatized man before helping the rest of them get back on their feet. Hours later, Rurik asks Vorn for a moment of his time, so they head inside the tent, where he explains that the captured Muezzanal soldiers spoke of an even larger army of almost 30,000 men who were supposed to continue their initial campaign. After considering the fact that they barely have up to 2,000 soldiers capable of fighting, Vorn decides to head out as soon as the sun rises, but he soon hears word of a unit of Muezzanal soldiers chasing after them. He immediately leads the remaining soldiers to hold them off. But the plan quickly falls apart as the Muezzanal soldiers ignore his initial attacks and continue charging towards them. The next moment, Vorn notices another army gathering by the mountainside and gets shocked to see Ludmilla leading them. During one of Elend's duels against Ludmilla years ago, Sasha suddenly showed up to stop them and decided to take them both on instead. She then promised to do whatever they wanted if they managed to land a single hit, while they would have to make up if she defeated them. After agreeing to her terms, they both attacked and ended up on the ground in a matter of seconds, so they reluctantly apologized to each other. Back in the present, Elend and Lim have just arrived at Sasha's castle, and after being led into her room, they exchange greetings before Elend demands to know the name of the war maiden foolish enough to attack her. Sasha then asks if she remembers Elizaveta before telling her to relax and hear the full story first. After Elend agrees to patiently listen, Sasha explains that after they both joined forces to fight a group of pirates months ago, Elizaveta claimed to have received word that Sasha's soldiers were redirecting the pirates to her army during the battle. As a result of this, they both parted ways, but Elizaveta recently decided to launch an attack against her because of it. After Sasha apologizes for causing such an inconvenience and says she has no idea why her blades still choose her as their war maiden, Elend tells her to sit back and promises to make sure Elizaveta pays for going against her. Sasha then asks if the rumors about her and Vorn are true, so Elend starts by explaining how interesting and brave he is. When Lim tries to make it sound like she gives him too much attention, Elend asks why she stopped being openly hostile to him after he drained poison from her melons. While they continue talking about Vorn, a warlord named Balamir gets intrigued by Vorn and Elend's recent escapades, so he sends an envoy out to see if Elend is really all that and pledges to support her if she is really as hot as the rumors claim. Meanwhile, Ludmilla has just told Vorn that he was wrong to thank her for coming to his aid because she didn't do it for free. He then asks what she wants, and she proceeds to call him a slow-brained dimwit for looking too eager to give her anything she wants. The next moment, he bows his head and says he is willing to do anything because he can't even afford to pay her properly for all her help. Upon hearing this, she decides to accept that he is just too pure and asks for the real power that destroyed the Citadel's gates, because Elend's sword doesn't have an ability powerful enough to blast such a precise hole through a steel gate with 3 layers. After admitting that it was his arrow, Vorn takes her to see it, and when she asks why he doesn't use it in battle more often, he explains the amount of power it takes to use it even once and says he barely even knows how to use it. She then takes a closer look at it and decides to settle for some sort of payment later on. so long as he uses its power in front of her during battle. A little while after this, Vorn steps out and meets Gerald, who then asks for Riz tips because it makes no sense that a peasant-level noble like him has been able to build strong connections with some of the most powerful hotties on the planet. After Vorn explains that he has only ever wanted to protect his people and help everyone else, Gerald tells him to come help them with Regine, the woman he saved from Zaolan soldiers, because she has refused to eat anything they serve her. Minutes later, Vorn takes some food into her tent to eat with her, but the moment he takes a spoon from his soup, he asks for it instead of eating the one he brought for her. Seeing that she has finally agreed to eat something, Vorn stands up to leave, but then she calls him back to ask for a favor. Around the same time, Elizaveta hears that Elen is marching towards her with a full army, so she prepares her soldiers for battle. By the time they both end up within each other's field of vision, Lim thinks back to when Sasha told her to protect Elen at all costs. However, as soon as Elizaveta charges in, Elen uses her wind magic to jump ahead, so Lim tries to catch up, but she tells her to focus on leading the soldiers so she can deal with Elizaveta. Minutes later, they both get off their horses and start unleashing every spell in the book to see who tastes dirt first. After Elizaveta finally manages to knock Elen off her feet, she tries to celebrate, but Elen tells her not to get cocky and fires off an extremely powerful spell that pushes Elizaveta back before she even realizes it. This causes her to realize that Elen is much stronger than before, so she offers some sort of truce, but Elen rejects it and says she only wants to see her head on a platter. Elizaveta then asks if she actually has time to spare for petty beef, because Ganelan and Felix are currently mobilizing their armies for a full-blown war, while another Zaolan army of over 40,000 men is already heading towards Brune. To even help her feel a little better, she offers to settle it all with a contract, so Elen agrees to stop trying to unalive her on the condition that she has to sincerely apologize to Sasha. After their armies part ways, Elen returns to Sasha to share the good news and quickly gathers the rest of her men to go help Vorn. Hours later, Vorn and Rurik join Ludmilla for a strategy meeting, and after minutes of trying to cook up a new plan, she tells him to just do what he did to Kasim, but further explains that they are dealing with a far more ruthless warlord. When they both ask how she knows who he is, she takes a seat and decides to give them a history lesson about how powerful Balamir truly is. After making sure they understand how easily they can lose the battle to him, she spends the following hours preparing a better strategy to ensure that Vorn gets close enough to murk him. Meanwhile, Balamir's troops have just stopped their march into Brunish territory because he expected to have already seen an army waiting to fight them. Just as he tries to think of a new plan, the messenger he sent into Brune earlier returns with a message from Ludmilla telling him to return to New Zealand because he doesn't want the smoke. Hearing that causes the blood-hungry lunatic to get excited again, so he tells the messenger to go relax and decides to continue their march into Brune. The next day, Balamir decides to split his army into separate units, so the first can focus on defeating Vorn and Ludmilla's army stationed on a hill, while the others would catch up to the slaves trying to escape from the battle. However, the first unit fails to get close to Vorn and Ludmilla's forces on the hill, so Balamir tells them to focus on the slaves instead. As they mount their horses and start charging towards the slaves, Vorn and Ludmilla launch a surprise attack from the hillside, causing Balamir to realize that the soldiers on the hill were actually decoys used to set them up for failure. A couple of minutes into the attack, Rurik also drops the slave disguise and orders his men to chase after the second unit of Balamir's army. But instead of accepting that they have easily managed to outsmart him, Balamir decides to continue the battle, hoping to eventually wear them out with his countless soldiers. As the battle continues, the rescued slaves hold up barricades at the top of the hill and think back to the previous night when Vorn asked for their help to defeat Balamir. At first, they were all too terrified to even think about it, but then the slave who cussed him out earlier explained that it was their best chance at surviving, so they agreed to stay back and fight. Back in the present, Balamir's plan to wear them off finally starts working, because most of Ludmilla and Vorn's soldiers begin to stumble across the fields as the stress of fighting for so many days catches up to them. Using that opportunity, Balamir's men attack and cut down as many weak soldiers as they can, while the rest of the troops surround Vorn and Ludmilla. At that moment, Vorn notices that his hand is barely able to keep up with shooting so many arrows, so he tells Ludmilla to escape and save herself. but she tells him to shut up and continues fighting to protect the honor of war maidens. While he also decides to fight by her side, Balamir gets excited to finally have the upper hand. But his smile quickly fades away when his soldiers inform him that 3 separate armies just joined the first against them. After Amila and another warrior named She introduced themselves and explained that Mashas sent them to help. A third knight named August runs up to greet Vorn, who then recognizes him as a former soldier who fought for Alsace when his dad was still alive. August also recognizes him and commends him on growing into a proper warrior like his dad. So Vorn thanks him for the help before he runs off with his army to continue attacking Balamir's men. After taking a moment to get his feelings in check, Vorn joins Ludmilla to continue fighting. But even with 3 separate armies joining them, they still end up taking more damage than Balamir's army. He also notices this and becomes relaxed again, thinking it will only be a matter of time before his men seize victory. But then Mashas and Hughes show up with 2 more armies to support Vorn. In a matter of minutes, Balamir loses over 6,000 men, so he orders the rest to retreat and says it doesn't matter as long as they still manage to secure the port town on the south of the Brunish Empire. Hours later, a messenger returns from the port town to tell him that Duke Felix completely wiped out the fleet he sent to capture the port town. So Balamir takes a moment to think and accepts that there is no way he can win this battle. He then decides to throw in the towel and summons a messenger before carefully giving him the right words to use when buttering up Vorn. Shortly after this, the messenger arrives in Vorn's camp and proceeds to yap about how great he is while he struggles to keep his eyes open. Minutes later, Ludmilla takes him back to his chambers to talk about their victory, but he suddenly falls asleep on her, so she decides to cuddle him instead. Early the next day, her staff picks up a familiar life force and wakes her up. So she listens closely and realizes who it is before grabbing Vorn to make Elen jealous. As expected, she gets jealous seeing them together, but decides to hide it since he still looks too tired to deal with a temper tantrum. Several hours later, the camp gets flooded with soldiers scrambling for food and supplies, so Titta decides to help them out along with Bertrand, while Mashas, Hughes, and Lim discuss how Vorn has gone from being the lord of a remote nation to becoming the 3rd strongest general in the empire. While they continue talking about it, Ludmilla offers to make him some tea in her tent. But this finally causes Elen to flip out, so she tries to drag him away. But Ludmilla holds him back and starts arguing over who gets to spend time with him. Right then, a random soldier asks Ludmilla for help sorting out their supplies, so Vorn offers to come see her later on. After she leaves, he heads out with Elen to enjoy some peace and quiet and suddenly starts apologizing for the soldiers he lost during the seemingly endless battles they had to fight. She then tells him to lay back on the grass with her and says the only thing they can do is pray for the souls of the fallen soldiers before holding his hand. Several days later, a war maiden named Valentina enters Vorn's room through a portal to get a good look at him. But he suddenly grabs her milkers and squeezes them for a couple of minutes before letting go and falling back asleep. Thankfully, she decides to spare his life, since he obviously wasn't thinking straight. Around the same time, Elen and Ludmilla meet up on the walls outside of the city they decided to use as a new camping spot. After Ludmilla asks why she has not returned to Zictid and says her presence is useless since returned late, Elen thanks her for helping Vorn in her place. She then tells Ludmilla to go back home since has returned, but Ludmilla refuses and says she still has business with Vorn. Shortly after this, Mashas calls Vorn out for a meeting, and after taking a couple of minutes to figure out why his hand feels like it touched something divine, Vorn asks why they had to wake him up so early. Just as Mashas reveals that it has to do with Prince Regnaz, who got unalived in battle against Elen, Bertrand walks in and tells Vorn that Regine has been asking to see him. The moment she walks in, Mashas freezes in shock, but Vorn notices that Regine still feels shy, so he assures her that they can all be trusted. When she admits to being Prince Regnaz, Mashas passes out, so Titta spends a couple of minutes making sure he is okay, while Ludmilla asks Elen how he survived a battle against her. After she explains that a last-minute attempt on her life stopped her from collecting heads as usual, they still struggle to believe that Regine is actually the prince, so she reminds Vorn of the time many years ago when they snuck away from a festival to eat a bird he managed to hunt down. They then ask why she was pretending to be a guy in the first place, so she reminds them that a queen who cannot give birth to a male heir is considered worthless in the Brune Empire. Since her mother was only able to conceive her, they had to turn her into a boy to stay safe from exile. After listening to this, Elen and Ludmilla both agree that helping her now will only cause problems that might lead to Vorn losing the trust he only just managed to build with the people. Vorn then takes a moment to think and says the king would probably be able to help, but Mashas tells him to forget about it because the king is still mentally unstable. When Vorn asks why she even trusts him enough to reveal the truth, she reminds him of the previous night when she asked for help taking a bath and exposed her cakes right in front of him. Upon hearing this, Elen asks if she lost her mind because he could have taken advantage of the situation, but she explains that it was all part of her test to see if he could be trusted. After taking a moment to think, Vorn asks Regin if she can prove that she is actually Regnaz, so she tells them about a secret door somewhere underneath Lutetia, Gaimlan's capital, that is only accessible to people in the royal family. Days later, Felix receives 5 new dragons to replace the ones he lost, and after learning that the chains around them resist War Maiden magic, he gets excited to test them out. Meanwhile, Gaimlan starts cooking up one last scheme to pit Felix against Vorn in Lutetia, since he already expects them to show up in the coming days for the secret door Regin spoke about. Just a few days later, Felix's dragons start burning Lutetia to the ground, and after he receives word of Vorn's plan to find the door, he decides to prepare his army for a proper ambush. However, a couple of days after this, Vorn and the others learn that Gaimlan suddenly set fire to Lutetia before vanishing from the empire. After also hearing that Felix's army is still in the region, Vorn decides to have a battle against his forces if it means that they can prove Regin's status as the king's daughter. The next day, both armies clash as planned, and while Vorn leads the soldiers into battle against Felix's army, Elen and Ludmilla join forces to take down the first 3 dragons. Ludmilla then tries to attack the 2-headed dragon, and after she fails to even scratch it, the fire breather attacks, but Elen jumps in to save her and gets burned. While Ludmilla immediately uses her powers to freeze the burn, Felix gets excited to see that the dragons can actually hold them back, so he orders the rest of his soldiers to prepare to attack them if they somehow manage to survive. Hours later, both sides retreat to work on their attack strategies, and after figuring out how the dragons manage to survive their attacks, Ludmilla and Elen decide to use a special attack during the next clash. Several hours later, they head out to fight again, but this time, all the soldiers on Vorn's side march without any armor or proper gear, so Felix's generals ask if he has any idea what they are planning. He easily realizes that they just want to lure his soldiers out and leave the dragons to Ludmilla and Elen, but he still decides to proceed with the attack, fully convinced that there is nothing they can do to win. As planned, Vorn's soldiers quickly run back and put their armor back on, while Ludmilla and Elen immediately start attacking the dragons to find a weak spot. Minutes later, Vorn and his soldiers begin to overwhelm Felix's army with an endless rain of arrows and rocks, and while they chant his name and attack even harder, the girls finally manage to clap the fire-breathing dragon. However, the Hydra easily knocks Elen down, so Ludmilla holds it back before giving her the signal to merge both of their powers into one final attack. After syncing up their weapons, they both charge in, and Ludmilla first fires off a bunch of powerful icicles to create a weak point in the dragon's scales before Elen stabs into it and releases a powerful explosion that cooks it from the inside. Early the next day, Elen and the rest of the girls take a bath together, and while Ludmilla spends most of it hiding her fun-sized melons away, Elen celebrates the fact that they no longer have to worry about Felix and chases after Lim to grab her milkers. Afterwards, they head into Vorn's tent to wake him up for breakfast, only to see that he passed out before even getting to bed. After thinking of all the safe ways to wake him up, Elen decides to check if he actually has a hunter's instinct by basically straddling him. The moment she stares at him with a little bit of evil intent, he springs up and flips her over with one hand on her milkers before fully opening his eyes and realizing what is happening. A couple of minutes later, Tida serves them breakfast and explains that most of it came from neighboring settlements just trying to maintain a good reputation with him. After Ludmilla tells him to make sure Gerald and Rurik pay them in full for everything, they all ask him for the next course of action now that Felix is on the run with the rest of his army. Vorn then says that they still have to prove Regin's royal status, because it's the final step to gaining the trust of all Brune, and after they agree to it, Regin explains the 3 locations where they can find an entrance into the Holy Grotto. After carefully considering the distance and risk involved with each of them, Vorn decides to go with the temple on the outskirts of Artesium. Hours later, he tells Rurik and Gerald to handle payments to all the settlements that gave them gifts, and after they both head out, Bertrand enters to ask for permission to join this last mission. When Vorn tells him not to worry about it, Bertrand explains that his old bones won't give him the strength to keep up when he leaves for Zictid, so he plans to spend every waking moment by his side until then. This causes Vorn to get a little emotional, so he accepts. But after Bertrand runs off to get ready, Hélène suddenly decides to tag along as well. Lim and Ludmilla immediately tell her to forget about it, and remind her to start acting with a little more self-respect. But she explains that it's purely for protection. Vorn eventually agrees, but only on the condition that she has to save herself first if anything happens. The next day, they head out and find the temple in just a few hours, but opening the secret doorway ends up being a lot harder than they expected. After finally managing to make it inside the tunnel system underneath, Ridgeon explains that it was used by the founding fathers of Brünn as a stronghold before they gained full control of the land. Shortly after this, they find a mural depicting the Great War between gods and dragons. But just as Ridgeon points out where the Holy Grotto is, Hélène and Vorn rush out to face Felix. Upon seeing his army waiting for them, Ridgeon freezes in fear, so Hélène rushes in to attack him while Rurik and the soldiers they brought fight to keep Ridgeon protected. While Hélène immediately starts clashing swords with Felix, Vorn helps Rurik stay alive. But then a powerful knight named Steed casually tears through an entire unit of soldiers before telling the rest to fall back because he only came for Vorn and Ridgeon. Upon hearing this, Rurik charges in to attack him, and Vorn also fires off an arrow hoping to blow his head off. But he blocks both their attacks and commends Vorn on being able to get an accurate shot despite the fact that there is barely any light around them. While they both struggle to hold him back, Hélène also gets knocked down by Felix, but she manages to pick herself up to continue fighting. However, the entire tunnel system suddenly starts falling apart, so they all scramble to escape, but Steed decides to unalive Vorn regardless of what is happening. After managing to knock him down, he raises his sword for the final slice, and Vorn stares up at him with fear in his eyes, but Bertrand suddenly jumps in before the Holy Grotto caves in. Moments later, Vorn wakes up and checks to make sure his body is still intact before seeing Steed crushed between some rocks. After closing his eyelids, he remembers how Bertrand jumped in and gets excited to see that he is still in one piece. However, after getting closer, he sees blood pouring out of his side and realizes that he took that final slice right to the guts before everything collapsed. The moment he grabs his hand, Bertrand notices that his hand is warm and thanks him for letting his life amount to something useful. But Vorn refuses to accept that he is dying and tells him that they still have to return to Alsace for spring. The next moment, Bertrand starts talking about how he never expected Vorn to become such a brave warrior and tells him to look out for Tidda before joining his ancestors in the afterlife. At that moment, Hélène and the others make it to the second entrance to the Holy Grotto. But just as they get close enough, Vorn fires off a god-level arrow that completely evaporates the entire tunnel system in a matter of seconds. Hélène immediately follows the light of the explosion and runs into the crater to save him. However, after spotting Bertrand's body, she checks on him to be sure and takes a moment of silence to think before asking for ropes to take him back. Hours later, Tidda serves them all some tea and walks out without saying a single word. Gerald then asks Masha if there is any hope of Vorn getting back to normal anytime soon, but he says there is no way to know since he has barely said a word. Shortly after this, Tidda joins Vorn in his room to make sure he doesn't do anything stupid, but then Hélène walks in and decides to snap him out of it. After sitting beside him, she asks for the next course of action and says they can completely forfeit the war and give Felix a bunch of terms for surrender, which he is likely to accept. When Vorn asks what she intends to do, she tells him that it doesn't matter as long as she can do it with pride. After he remembers the last time she said something like that during a battle, she explains how it became her entire identity way before she even became a recognized war maiden in Zictid. This causes him to realize that rotting away won't do anything to honor Bertrand's sacrifice, so he walks over to Tidda and apologizes for making her worried. The next moment, she rushes into his arms in tears, so he further promises to return to Alsace with her to give Bertrand a proper burial. Several minutes later, Hélène tells him that there is another reason behind her commitment to fighting alongside him. after she tells him that the Muzalan army doesn't just target random nations for no reason. He recalls that they specifically wanted to take control of the port town at the southern border and realizes that connecting that town to neighboring nations would open up a new age of trade that could completely change the world as they know it. Elen then explains that connecting her region in Zicted to the port town while building an amazing relationship with him and the rest of Brunn would foster a new age of peace where all their different cultures can coexist without the threat of war. After giving it some thought, he accepts it and heads out to see Ludmilla and the others, who have been waiting to check on him. The next day, Pierre shows up to see Regine, and after telling Vorn that they have actually met a long time ago when his dad was still alive, he tells the rest of them that the king is finally getting better because they managed to discover the poison Gainlon was feeding him before it was too late. He then asks Vorn for his true intentions with the battles they have been fighting. So Vorn explains his goal of ensuring the safety of Alsace and says he is willing to submit Alsace to Zicted if it means that his people will finally have peace. After taking a moment to consider everything, Pierre tells him to head to the capital city with Regine because the king won't last much longer. However, Vorn tells him that they will have to face Felix one last time because he definitely won't want them to meet the king. Several hours later, an intense battle begins between both armies, and as both sides rapidly start losing soldiers, Regine begins to doubt herself and asks if it was smart to make her the supreme commander. Mashas and Lim then assure her that there is nothing to worry about because Felix completely lost control over his army's formation and tactics after Steed's death. Just as she takes a closer look and sees that his soldiers are all over the place, he shows up to face Vorn once and for all and explains how he intended to burn Alsace to the ground just to secure his claim for the throne. Upon hearing this, Vorn promises to finish him off for Bertrand and every other person they lost, and after Felix also promises to get revenge for Zion, Vorn pulls back the bow and recalls how he finally unlocked its full powers after Bertrand's death. He then charges up the bow with enough power to destroy an entire nation. But Elen suddenly knocks the anger out of his head and tells him to keep his sanity while seeking revenge. After thanking her, he starts heading towards Felix and only takes a single arrow to attack him. Upon seeing this, Felix calls him a fool and charges in with his sword to attack. But Vorn calmly smiles and fires the shot straight to his head. The next moment, Felix finds himself staring up at the clouds and wonders how Vorn managed to control his arrow with wind magic before his light gets cut off. Just then, Elen checks with her sword to see if it helped him control the wind, and after learning that he actually did it on his own, she and Ludmilla find another reason to fight for his love. Days later, Gainlon arrives at the port town and thanks Valentina for all her help before she tells him that Vorn's homecoming has probably kicked off. In the capital city, minutes later, locals flood the streets in celebration as Vorn and Regine pass through the city center in a carriage. While Vorn struggles to adjust to the royal attire they made him wear, Elen and Ludmilla start arguing over who gets to sit beside him next. Minutes later, they arrive at the palace and head inside to see King Farron, who then apologizes to Regine for not being smart enough to figure out what Gainlon and Felix were up to. After thanking Vorn for protecting her, he offers to grant any request, so Vorn asks for a peace treaty between Brunn and Zicted, as well as release of the port town to Zicted as well. Moments later, Farron makes Regine take over as the signatory to indicate that she will be the next ruler. But then he also decides to grant Vorn a title known as the Knight of Moonlight. Days later, he quietly passes on while in bed, and life slowly takes a more peaceful turn for Vorn and the girls as they adjust to the agreements between both empires. With Regine being named as the next queen, will Vorn get called to rule at her side? Comment part 2 to find out, and don't forget to turn on post notifications after subscribing to make sure you never miss any of our recaps.